She didn't cry when her mother said it. That was the worst part. Evelyn Marlowe stood perfectly still in the middle of that glittering Virginia parlor, her fingers curled tight around a leather ledger, while her mother's laughter floated through the room, like smoke pretty and poisonous. Desirable? Lord, no. She had heard it 1,000 times. But tonight something was different. Tonight a man was watching her. And he wasn't looking at her sisters. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe, follow till the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Evelyn Marlowe decided she would never again apologize for her own mind began the same way most humiliations did in her family, with a social gathering she hadn't wanted to attend, in a dress that didn't quite fit, standing in a corner she hadn't chosen. It was the Hargrove estate, third Friday of September. The kind of evening where Virginia's finest families came dressed in their best ambitions, daughters polished like silverware, mothers circling the room like hawks in silk gloves. Evelyn had arrived late, not fashionably late genuinely, accidentally late, because she had been in the middle of reconciling her father's quarterly grain accounts and had lost track of time. She'd pinned her hair on the walk from the carriage. One button on her left glove was still undone. She noticed all of this the moment she stepped inside and caught her reflection in the tall parlor mirror near the entrance. Her younger sister Clara was already at the center of the room, laughing with a group of young men, her golden curls catching the lamplight. Her other sister, Rose, was seated at the piano, playing something slow and deliberate, making sure every eye in the room found her fingers, then her face. Evelyn found the nearest empty chair and sat down with her ledger. Yes, she had brought a ledger to a social gathering. She knew what that looked like. She didn't particularly care. At least that was what she told herself. Evelyn. Her mother appeared from the crowd with the speed and precision of a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of graceful ambush. Margaret Marlowe was beautiful in the way old Virginia money was beautiful, maintained, deliberate, and faintly exhausting. She looked at the ledger. She looked at Evelyn's undone glove button. She looked at Evelyn, she said, not unkindly. Worst, patiently, way you speak to a child who keeps touching the stove. I'm almost finished the Q3 reconciliation, Evelyn said. Father's been miscounting the Evelyn. Her mother's voice dropped. This is the Hargrove estate, not your father's study. I know where we are. Then act like it. Margaret reached over and gently, firmly closed the ledger. Smile, move about the room. Mr. Aldridge's son is here tonight, the younger one, not the one with the gout. And the Pembroke family brought their nephew all the way from Richmond. I don't know the Pembrokes. That is exactly the point of tonight, Evelyn. Evelyn said nothing. She let her mother take the ledger and set it on the chair behind her. She straightened her spine. She undid and redid the glove button correctly. And she followed her mother into the room. She lasted approximately 14 minutes before she found herself standing near the window, half hidden behind a potted fern, watching the way the candlelight hit the brass fixtures on the far wall and calculating out of pure habit approximately how much it would cost to light this room for an evening. 40 candles at minimum, more along the staircase. 6 wall sconces, if they burn 3 hours. She heard her mother's voice before she located the source. Margaret Marlowe was standing near the center of the room with 3 other women Mrs. Hargrove, Mrs. Pembroke, and a younger woman Evelyn didn't recognize. They were all looking in her direction. Evelyn went still. My Evelyn, her mother was saying, with that particular fond but apologetic tone that Evelyn had grown up understanding meant I love you and I am embarrassed by you simultaneously. She is wonderfully intelligent. Truly. She could run a railroad if you let her. The women smiled. But, Margaret continued, lowering her voice just enough that it carried, she doesn't know how to make a man feel like a man. And that, I'm afraid, is a woman's most important skill. Knowing nods. She makes men feel stupid, Margaret added. Not on purpose, God bless her, But there it is. More laughter. Evelyn turned back to the window. Her jaw was tight. Her hands, folded in front of her, were perfectly still. She did not cry. She had cried about this particular wound when she was 19. She was 26 now, and she had simply run out of tears for it. What remained instead was something quieter and more durable, a kind of low, constant ache, like a bruise you've stopped noticing, because it never fully heals. She makes men feel stupid. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass of the window. Maybe, she thought, or maybe men don't like being outpaced. There's a difference. But she kept that thought, like most of her thoughts, entirely to herself. That was when she noticed the bridge. Or rather, the architectural flaw in the decorative illustration of a bridge, framed and hung on the wall beside the window. It was a painting of some European crossing, ornamental and clearly purchased for aesthetics rather than accuracy. But the load-bearing arch in the illustration was structurally wrong. The keystone was centered incorrectly. Any engineer worth his salt would have caught it immediately. Evelyn leaned slightly closer, tilting her head. The lateral pressure distribution would be completely uneven. That bridge would collapse inside of 5 years. You're staring at that painting like it owes you money. The voice came from directly behind her, low, unhurried. Male. She turned. The man standing there was not someone she recognized, which was notable. Evelyn made it her business to know who her mother considered worth knowing, if only to avoid them efficiently. He was tall. Not in the performative way of men who knew they were tall, more in the way of someone who had simply grown that way, and never thought much about it. Dark coat, well cut, but not fussy, no pocket square. No decorative flourishes. He was holding a glass of something amber and largely untouched. His eyes gray, she thought, or possibly a dark green in this light, were watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not interest, exactly. More like recognition, the way you look at something that surprises you by being exactly what it appears to be. The arch is wrong, she said, because she had been raised to be honest even when it wasn't strategic. The keystone placement, the whole load-bearing calculation is off. In a real bridge built this way, the lateral pressure would cause cracking within. 4 to 6 years, he said, depending on weather conditions and traffic weight. She stopped. He hadn't said it to finish her sentence. He'd said it, as a matter of fact, the same way she would have said it, flat and certain. Yes, she said carefully. Exactly. He looked at the painting. My company contracted a bridge in Tennessee last spring. The original engineer made the same error. We caught it before construction began, but it cost us 3 weeks. Your company, she repeated. Whitaker Rail and Land. He looked back at her. Nathaniel Whitaker. She knew the name. Everyone in Virginia knew the name. Whitaker Rail and Land was one of the largest privately held operations in the eastern United States. Nathaniel Whitaker had inherited it at 28 after his father's death, and had in the years since turned it into something considerably larger than his father had built. She had read about him in 3 separate financial journals. She had not expected him to look like this, like someone who had simply walked into a party because he happened to be passing and hadn't yet found a reason to leave. Evelyn Marlowe, she said. My father has a small landholding outside Charlottesville. Nothing that would interest you. You'd be surprised what interests me, he said. He glanced toward the center of the room, where her mother was still holding court, still laughing, then back to Evelyn. I overheard what was said earlier. Her chin lifted slightly. Then you've been warned off. Or informed, he said. There's a difference. She studied him. He didn't look away. Most men, she said, find it easier to simply avoid the problem. I don't avoid problems, he said. I assess them. And what's your assessment? He looked at her, not her dress, not her hair, not the undone glove button she'd repaired too hastily, but at her, the way she'd always wanted to be looked at, the way she'd stopped expecting anyone to bother. That you're the most interesting person in this room, he said, and no one here is smart enough to notice. She didn't know what to say to that. She who always knew what to say, and so she said the only honest thing she could. That's either a very genuine observation, she told him, or a very sophisticated line. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained and she thought more real. Which would you prefer it to be? The truth, she said. Always the truth. I have no use for anything else. He was quiet for a moment. Then good, neither do I. Her mother found her 20 minutes later. By then, Evelyn and Nathaniel Whitaker had moved from the painting to the window, from the window to the far corner of the room, and from the far corner into a quiet argument about the most efficient method for surveying and subdividing agricultural land for dual-purpose use grazing and cultivation on the same acreage. It was the most engaged Evelyn had been at a social event in 4 years. Margaret Marlowe arrived at her daughter's elbow with the controlled expression of a woman who had just witnessed she didn't know how to categorize. "Mr. Whitaker," she said warmly, "I hope my daughter hasn't been bending your ear too thoroughly." "Quite the opposite," he said. "She's solved a problem I've had with my northern acreage for 2 years." Margaret blinked. How wonderful, Mrs. Marlowe." He inclined his head slightly. "Your daughter has a remarkable mind." It was said plainly, without flattery or performance. A statement of fact. Margaret smiled the smile she used when she didn't know what emotion to have. "Yes, well, she certainly does read a great deal." "She thinks a great deal," he said. "There's a distinction." Margaret's smile tightened just slightly at the corners. "Of course." He turned back to Evelyn. "I have a surveying problem I'd like a second perspective on. Would you be willing to look at the maps?" Evelyn looked at her mother. Her mother's expression was unreadable. She looked back at Nathaniel Whitaker. "Yes," she said, "I would." She did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual. Evelyn rarely slept well. Her mind ran long after her body was ready to be still, cataloging the day's loose ends, tallying figures, turning problems over like stones to see what lived underneath. But tonight the restlessness had a different quality. She lay in the narrow bed of her childhood room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, and thought about a man who had looked at a painting and seen the same flaw she had. She thought about the way he'd said, "I don't avoid problems. I assess them." She thought, with the cautious and experienced pragmatism of a woman who had been disappointed before, that she should not think about it at all. He was Nathaniel Whitaker. He ran an empire. He had, she knew from the financial journals, been previously engaged briefly to a Miss Harriet Colton of Baltimore, before the engagement was dissolved under circumstances the papers had described only as mutual and amicable. He lived on a 1,200-acre estate in the Shenandoah Valley. He moved in circles that didn't overlap with hers. He had probably spoken to her because she was different, and different was briefly interesting, and brief interest was not the same thing as genuine regard. She knew this. She catalogued it carefully, the way she catalogued everything. And then she lay there in the dark, still thinking about the way he'd said the most interesting person in this room. Clara appeared in her doorway just after midnight. "You spoke to Nathaniel Whitaker for 45 minutes, her younger sister said, without preamble. "People are talking." "They were going to talk about something," Evelyn said. "It may as well be something interesting." Clara came in and sat on the edge of the bed, tucking her feet beneath her. She was 22 and bright-eyed and genuinely kind, which Evelyn loved about her. Clara had never once resented Evelyn's mind, only been baffled by it. "Mama is in a state," Clara said. "She doesn't know if she's happy or terrified." "That tracks. He's very handsome," Clara offered. "He's also structurally literate and has a working understanding of agricultural land economics, which is considerably more relevant." Clara stared at her. "Evelyn, he's one of the wealthiest men in Virginia." "I'm aware. And he spent 45 minutes talking to you." "I'm also aware of that." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, gently, "Don't do that thing where you talk yourself out of it before it even begins." Evelyn looked at her sister. He's probably just... Don't, Clara said. Just don't. Not tonight. Just let it be what it was. What it was a beginning, though Evelyn wouldn't have used that word yet. Beginnings required optimism, and she had learned to ration hers carefully. But 3 days later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to her father formally, as convention required, a request for permission to call on the Marlowe household on the matter of land consultation. It was signed Nathaniel Whitaker. It mentioned, at the close of the letter, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried, and bore no resemblance to the looping flourishes fashionable men used, "I would be grateful for Miss Evelyn's perspective, if she is willing to offer it." Her father read it twice. Then he looked at Evelyn over the top of his reading glasses. "He wants your opinion on land mapping," her father said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Not your mother's opinion. Not your sister's." "Yours, Papa." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very simply, "All right." He came on Thursday. Evelyn had told herself she would not dress differently. She had told herself she would meet him in the study, with the maps, and be professional and useful, and not read anything into any of it. She wore her second-best dress. Not because of him, she simply happened to take it from the wardrobe that morning. She also, she admitted privately, repinned her hair twice. He arrived at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a land agent named Harvis, who spent most of the meeting looking confused about why he was there. Nathaniel Whitaker spread 4 survey maps across the study table and looked at Evelyn and said, without ceremony, "Tell me what you see." She looked at the maps. She told him what she saw. 40 minutes later, Harvis had stopped looking confused and started writing things down at a speed that suggested he was trying not to lose anything. Nathaniel Whitaker stood with his arms crossed and watched Evelyn point to problem areas and recommend adjustments with the focused attention of a man who was not used to being surprised and found it unexpectedly valuable. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You identified every issue I've been working around for 18 months, he said. "The northeastern parcel is the most urgent," she said. "The water table data here," she tapped the map, "is at least 4 years outdated. If you're planning to expand the rail line in this direction, you need a new survey before you commit any capital." "Yes," he said. "Not thank you, how interesting, just yes." Agreement, confirmation, equal to equal. She looked up from the map. He was watching her. Not the map, her. "Would you be willing," he said, carefully, "to review the updated survey when it comes in? I can send the documentation directly, with your father's permission, of course." "Yes," she said. "And I'd like your perspective on the grain storage question as well. The North Barn calculation. Send me the figures." "I will." Harvis cleared his throat. They both looked at him as though they had forgotten he existed. He said. "I'll wait by the carriage." He gathered his things and left. The study was very quiet. "Miss Marlowe," Nathaniel said. "Mr. Whitaker, I hope this has been stopped." Reconsidered, started again. "I want to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "I don't have much use for indirection." "Neither do I." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she hadn't seen from him, yet a hesitation, small and controlled, like a crack in a wall that was otherwise solid. "I find your company valuable," he said. "I want to continue it. I'm telling you that plainly, because I think you prefer plain things," and he paused. "I've found that most people don't actually want plain things when it comes to certain conversations. But I'm guessing you do." Evelyn's heart was doing something she was going to catalog later, privately, when she had time to be methodical about it. "You guessed correctly," she said. "Good," he said. "Then I'll be in touch about the survey." He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Miss Marlowe." "Yes, your mother was wrong," he said quietly. "About what she said at the Hargrove estate." Evelyn went very still. "A woman who makes a man think," he said, "is not a problem to be managed. She's a rare and considerable thing." He put his hat on and walked out. Evelyn stood in the study for a long moment. Then she sat down in her father's chair. Then she put her face in her hands, not to cry, but because she needed a moment where no one could see whatever was happening to her expression. Outside the window, she heard the carriage pull away. Inside her chest, something that had been very carefully and deliberately closed for a very long time had just quietly, without asking permission, cracked open. She straightened, smoothed her dress, took a breath, pulled the nearest map toward her. The northeastern parcel, she thought. Water table data. She worked until supper. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't only thinking about the numbers. The world had decided, long before Evelyn Marlowe had a chance to decide for herself, exactly what she was worth. And she had believed it, not because she was foolish, but because it is very hard to stand against a verdict that every voice around you agrees on. But a verdict, she was beginning to understand, is only binding if you accept it. And Nathaniel Whitaker had just called it into question. Which meant, for the first time in 26 years, so did she. The survey arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew it was from him before she even opened the envelope, because her name was written on the front in that same precise, unhurried hand she'd memorized from the letter to her father, each letter formed with the kind of deliberate care that suggested a man who did not write anything casually. She opened it at the study desk alone before her mother was awake. Inside were 12 pages of updated land survey documentation, a separate sheet of water table measurements, and a handwritten note that read, "Miss Marlowe, the Northeastern Parcel Survey, as promised. The water table figures are more concerning than I initially anticipated. I've marked the 3 areas of primary concern. I would value your assessment when time permits. NW, no pleasantries, no filler. Just the problem, clearly stated, and an honest request for her perspective." She read the entire survey before breakfast. By the time her mother came downstairs and found her at the table, Evelyn had already drafted 2 pages of notes and identified what she believed was a fundamental error in the survey methodology itself, not the results, but the process by which they'd been obtained. "You're working already," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "The Whitaker survey came," Evelyn said. Her mother went still in the doorway. "He sent it directly to you?" "To the house. Addressed to father but designated for my review." Margaret Marlowe poured herself coffee and sat down across from her daughter with the careful movements of a woman deciding how to feel about something. She looked at the pages spread across the table. She looked at Evelyn's notes. "He's serious then," she said finally. "About the consultation." "He appears to be. And you think it's only the consultation he's serious about?" Evelyn looked up. Her mother's eyes were not unkind. That was the complicated thing about Margaret Marlowe. She was rarely unkind. She was simply convinced she was right, which was sometimes harder to navigate than cruelty. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that I'm not going to speculate about things I don't have data for." "Data," her mother repeated softly. "Evelyn, he's a man, not a land survey." "I'm aware. Men like Nathaniel Whitaker," her mother said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup, "need a certain kind of woman beside them. Not because it's fair, but because that's the world. They need someone who can hold a room, someone gracious, someone who makes other people feel comfortable and welcome, and someone who makes them feel smart," Evelyn said. Her mother flinched slightly. "I didn't say that. You said it at the Hargrove estate." The kitchen was very quiet. "I was trying to be honest," her mother said. "I was trying to prepare you. You were trying to lower my expectations before I could raise them myself." Evelyn said it without venom, just clearly, the way she stated everything. "And I understand why. I know you do it because you're afraid I'll be hurt." "But Mama," she stopped, looked down at the survey pages. "He sent me 12 pages of land data and asked for my assessment. Not my charm, not my social graces, my assessment." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Just be careful," she said at last. "I'm always careful. No, her mother said, you're always precise. Those aren't the same thing. Evelyn didn't have an answer for that. So she went back to the survey. But her mother's words sat with her all morning, like a stone in her boot small enough to ignore, persistent enough to ache. She sent her response to Nathaniel Whitaker by afternoon post. 4 pages. Detailed. She had found 2 errors in the surveyor's methodology, one significant enough that it would affect his capital planning if left uncorrected, and she said so plainly. His reply came the following morning. You were right. I've already contacted the surveyor. Your methodology note is being incorporated into the revised scope. Can you meet Thursday? There's a question about the North Barn figures that I'd rather discuss in person. She wrote back, Thursday at 10. Bring the barn inventory records, not just the figures. His reply to that was a single line, already planned to. Clara found Evelyn smiling at a piece of correspondence for the first time in living memory and told her gravely that she needed to sit down and think very carefully about her life choices. Evelyn told Clara to mind her own affairs. She was still smiling when she said it. Thursday came. He arrived exactly at 10, which she had expected. What she hadn't expected was that he came alone, no Harvest, no land agent, no intermediary buffer. Just Nathaniel Whitaker, with a leather satchel of documents and the same unhurried quality of presence that she'd noticed at the Hargrove estate. He shook her father's hand, said something brief and genuine that made her father nod with approval, and then looked at Evelyn and said, "Shall we?" They worked for 2 hours. The North Barn question turned out to be considerably more complex than the letter had suggested, not just a matter of storage calculation, but of structural capacity, weight load tolerance, and a forward-planning question about whether to expand or rebuild entirely. Evelyn had opinions about all of it, expressed them, defended them when he pushed back, and revised 2 of them when his counterarguments were better than hers. That last part, revising her position when the evidence warranted it, seemed to surprise him. Most people, he said, watching her cross out a line in her notes and write a corrected figure, don't do that. Do what? Change their minds out loud, in front of someone else. She looked up. Why wouldn't I? You were right about the load tolerance. I'd calculated for current capacity, not projected expansion. That's a real error, I know. Most people would rather defend the error than admit it. That seems exhausting, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not the controlled, assessing look she'd come to recognize, something more unguarded, like a window opened briefly in a house that was usually shut. It is, he said quietly. Exhausting is exactly the right word. She looked at him for a moment. Not at the documents. At him. Do people do that to you often, she asked. Defend errors they know are errors, just to avoid being wrong in front of you. He picked up his pen. Set it down again, my lawyers. My board members. The men who work for me and want to keep working for me, he paused. Almost everyone, in my experience. That must make it very hard to know what's actually true, she said. He looked at her. I won't do that, she said. I'm not built for it. If I'm wrong, I'll say so. If I think you're wrong, I'll say that too. I'm counting on it, he said, and went back to the documents. But the window, that brief, unguarded thing, stayed with her, long after the meeting ended and his carriage had pulled away, and she was standing in the empty study, staring at the barn figures still spread across the table. He was lonely. She recognized it because she knew the particular texture of it, not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw only the version of you that was useful to them. Who engaged with the surface because the surface was impressive and the inside was inconvenient. She knew that loneliness the way you know a scar by the shape of it, the way it didn't quite hurt anymore, but never entirely stopped. She gathered the papers carefully and went to find her father. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing. Standing in that study with her barn figures and her careful pragmatism and her newly cracked open sense of possibility, was that Nathaniel Whitaker had sat in his carriage on the road back to the Shenandoah Valley for 20 minutes before telling the driver to go, because he'd needed that long to compose himself. He hadn't expected her to say, "I won't do that." He hadn't expected to believe her completely. The meetings became a pattern. Thursdays, mostly. Sometimes a second meeting midweek when a question was too complex for correspondence. Letters in between, always substantive, always about the work, but growing incrementally longer as the weeks passed, the margins beginning to accumulate small observations that had nothing to do with water tables or land surveys. She mentioned, once, that she'd read a paper on rail line efficiency published out of Philadelphia and found 3 logical errors in the methodology. He wrote back asking which 3. She listed them. He replied, "You missed a 4th. Page 12, the load variance calculation. Though I'll grant yours are more significant." She stared at that letter for a full minute. Then she went and found the paper and checked page 12. He was right. She'd missed it. She wrote back, "Correct. I'll revise my assessment. How long have you been reading efficiency methodology papers in your spare time?" His reply, "Since I was 14. My father gave me one to keep me occupied on a train journey." Apparently it worked. She read that and thought about a 14-year-old boy on a train, reading efficiency papers the way other children read adventure stories, and felt something warm and private move through her chest. She wrote, "I read my first agricultural economics text at 11. My father's. I thought it was a novel at first." He wrote back, "Was it?" She replied, "In its own way, yes. All those numbers telling a story about what the land could become. I found it more interesting than most novels." His reply took 2 days longer than usual. When it came, it was brief. "I've never heard anyone describe it that way before." It's exactly right. Clara intercepted that particular letter before Evelyn could put it away and read it standing in the front hallway. "In its own way, yes." Clara read aloud, in a voice of great drama. "Evelyn, he's courting you through economics papers. He's engaging in professional correspondence. He said your description was exactly right. In letters, Evelyn, exactly right is practically a proposal. You read too many novels, and you don't read enough of them. That's the entire problem." Their mother, who had been listening from the sitting room, appeared in the hallway doorway with an expression that was half pleased and half alarmed, the precise emotional ratio she'd maintained for the past several weeks. "He's been here 4 times in 6 weeks, Margaret said." "For land consultation," Evelyn said. "Men who want land consultation," her mother said, "hire more consultants. They don't come themselves repeatedly to discuss water tables with a 26-year-old woman." Evelyn took her letter back from Clara and went upstairs. She sat on her bed and read it again. "I've never heard anyone describe it that way before." Exactly right. She thought about her mother's words. She thought about all the reasons this was probably not what Clara thought it was. She thought about Harriet Colton of Baltimore, the dissolved engagement, the circumstances described as mutual and amicable. She was very practiced at thinking of reasons things would not work out. It was her primary defense mechanism, and she knew it, and she used it anyway. She folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept important documents. She was reaching for her ledger when she heard boots on the front porch. Then her mother's voice, sharp with surprise, "Mr. Whitaker, we weren't expecting," and his voice, low and calm, "Forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Marlowe. I was in the area and had a document question I should have included in yesterday's post. Is Miss Evelyn available?" Evelyn was already at the top of the stairs. He was standing in the front hallway below, hat in hand, looking up as though he'd somehow known she would be there. He had a leather folder in his other hand. "The rail expansion documents came in this morning," he said. "There's a survey discrepancy you'd want to see. Come into the study," she said. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word. He followed Evelyn down the hall. The survey discrepancy was real, she could see that immediately. A property boundary inconsistency that would create a legal problem if not addressed before the expansion contracts were signed. She spread the documents across the desk and went to work on it with the focused intensity she brought to every problem. He stood beside her, and they worked through it together, pointing and correcting and questioning in the easy shorthand they'd developed over 6 weeks of close collaboration. At some point, she became aware that they were standing very close. Not improperly close, just close. The way you stand when you're both looking at the same document. Natural and functional, and somehow, right now, also something else entirely. She didn't move away. Neither did he. Here, she said, pointing to the boundary marker notation. This is the error. The surveyor used the 1,871 county line, but the county line was redrawn in 1,879. Everything east of this marker is based on incorrect jurisdictional data, which means the eastern quarter mile of projected track is on disputed ground. Potentially, you'd need a title search before you break ground. I'll send for one tomorrow. He straightened. She was aware of the precise moment he became aware of the proximity too, not because he stepped away, but because something in his stillness changed. Miss Marlowe, I didn't only come about the survey. The study was very quiet. She kept her eyes on the documents for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked up at him. I gathered that, she said. I want to be honest with you. That same quality she'd noticed the first time, the deliberate plainness, the refusal to dress things up in prettier language than they deserved. I find I'm looking for reasons to come here, to write. The work is real, it's always real, but the work isn't the only reason. She held very still. And I think, he continued, watching her face, that you've known that for at least 2 weeks, and have been deciding whether to be alarmed by it. She had been. She absolutely had been. I've been deciding, she said carefully, whether to trust it. That's fair, he said. I'd rather you take the time to trust it than take my word for it and be wrong. Most men would prefer I simply take their word. I'm not interested in what most men prefer. He picked up his hat. I'll send the title search request tomorrow, and I'll... A pause. Right, if that's still acceptable. It's acceptable, she said. He moved toward the door. Mr. Whitaker. He stopped. I want to be honest with you too, she said. I find I'm reading your letters more than once. Not for the content. He turned. For the first time since she'd met him, the control in his face softened fully, not broke. Not crumbled, but softened, like a fist deliberately opened. I know, he said quietly. I'm writing them more than once. Not for the content either. He left. Evelyn stood in the study alone. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. Her heart was doing that catalogued thing again, that thing she'd been filing away carefully for 2 weeks, the accelerated rhythm, and the warmth spread through her ribcage, and the irrational, terrifying, wonderful sense that the ground beneath her was shifting towards something new. She took a breath, then another. Then she went to find Clara, because there were some things a person needed to say out loud to another person before they became real, and Clara had been waiting to hear this particular thing for weeks. He came, Evelyn said, appearing in the sitting room doorway. Clara looked up from her book. She read Evelyn's face with the accuracy of a younger sister who had been studying that face for 22 years. She set the book down. Tell me everything, she said. And for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn did. The town talked, of course. Towns always did. Particularly small Virginia towns with long memories and a vested interest in knowing everyone's business and measuring everyone's life against the local standard for how things ought to go. The standard as it applied to the Marlowe girls was well established. Clara was the lovely one. Rose was the accomplished one. Evelyn was the other one. The one who'd scared off the Aldridge boy at 18 by correcting his arithmetic at a dinner party. The one who spent party evenings near the fern pots with her ledgers. The one about whom everyone had long agreed, with the gentle collective certainty of people who had decided something and saw no reason to revisit it, that she would probably end up managing her father's estate in some useful but unromantic capacity, never married, probably perfectly fine about it. And then Nathaniel Whitaker started coming to call. The first time he was seen driving through town toward the Marlowe property alone. No business partner, no official-looking entourage, Mrs. Hargrove mentioned it to Mrs. Pembroke over tea. Mrs. Pembroke mentioned it to her daughter. Her daughter mentioned it to approximately everyone. By the third week, it was the primary topic of conversation at every social gathering in a 20-mile radius. By the fifth week, things had gotten interesting. Evelyn became aware of the shift on a Wednesday afternoon when she went into town for her father's hardware order and realized, partway through the dry goods store, that Mrs. Aldridge, whose son Evelyn had famously corrected at age 18, was watching her from across the store with an expression that had no precedent in their prior interactions. It was, Evelyn realized after a moment, envy. Mrs. Aldridge was looking at her with envy. She had no idea what to do with that, so she bought the hardware and left. The woman who ran the post office, a thin, brisk woman named Mrs. Cooper, who had always treated Evelyn with the particular briskness reserved for people you consider slightly outside the normal social order, suddenly became warm. She commented on Evelyn's dress. She asked after her health. She mentioned, with careful casualness, that she understood Mr. Whitaker had been coming to the Marlowe place quite regularly. For land consultation, Evelyn said. Of course, said Mrs. Cooper, in a tone that meant nothing of the sort. She drove home deeply unsettled. It wasn't the attention she found unsettling. She'd been managed and observed and evaluated all her life. That was nothing new. What unsettled her was the source of it. These were people who had written her off years ago, settled the question of her value, and moved on. And now, because a powerful man had turned his attention in her direction, they were revising that assessment. Not because she had changed, because he had made her visible to them in a new way. That night she lay in bed and felt something sour settle in her stomach. She thought, what does it mean that his attention has changed what they see in me? Have I not always been this person? Did I need his eyes to make me legible to them? She thought, and if I did, what does that say about his eyes? And what does it say about mine? She didn't sleep well. Thursday came, and he came with it. She met him in the study, and they worked for an hour on the title search results, which had revealed 2 additional complications she'd half expected, and one she hadn't. She was thorough and focused, and said everything she meant to say about the documents. And then, when Harvis, who had resumed attending these meetings, apparently reassigned, stepped out to see to the horses, she said, I have a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, not kindly. He set down his pen. All right. When you first noticed me at the Hargrove estate, she kept her voice level. Before you spoke to me, what made you notice me specifically? He was quiet for a moment. You were the only person in the room who wasn't watching me. That's what I thought. She looked at her hands. I want you to understand why that troubles me slightly. Tell me. Because everyone in this town has started treating me differently, she said. People who never looked at me directly are suddenly very interested in my health and my dress and my opinions. And it isn't because I've done anything different. It's because you've come here. It's because you've looked at me. She paused. And I find I'm worried that I might be making the same error. They are valuing your attention because of who you are, rather than because of what it actually means. He was very still. And, she continued, because she had started, and there was no point stopping now, I'm worried that I don't know yet which one it is. Whether this is, she stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. Whether this is real, or whether I'm just grateful to be seen by someone who matters to other people. The silence lasted longer than she could comfortably hold. Then he said, That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. I told you I wasn't built for indirection, I know. He leaned forward slightly. Can I answer just as honestly, please? I noticed you because you weren't watching me, he said. But I kept coming back because of what happened when I talked to you. Because you corrected the survey methodology on our first meeting, and you were right, and you didn't soften it or wait for permission. Because you told me my counter-argument was better than yours, and revised your position without losing a single piece of yourself. Because every time I've been in this room with you, I've felt like I was talking to an actual person instead of a reflection of what they think I want to see. He paused. The attention of a wealthy man can open doors for people who didn't have them before. I know that. I know it's complicated. I don't have a clean answer for the complication. He looked at her steadily. But what I feel when I'm in this room has nothing to do with wanting you to be grateful. I need you to know that. I believe you, she said. But you're still worried. I'm always still worried, she said. That's my factory setting. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close. The closest she'd seen. Mine too. The door opened and Harvest returned, apologetic and oblivious, and they went back to the documents. But something had shifted. Not cracked open, she'd had that already weeks ago. This was different. This was something tested and held, like weight applied to a joint to see if it would bear it. It bore it, she thought, carefully and quietly, in the part of her mind she kept private. All right. All right, then. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel Whitaker asked her father if he could take Evelyn driving on Sunday afternoon. Not land consultation, not document review driving. The way a man who was courting a woman asked to spend time with her, formally and properly and with full acknowledgement of what the gesture meant. Her father said yes. Her mother said, in the kitchen afterward with her hands pressed to the counter as though she needed support, well, I did not see this coming. Yes, you did, Mama, Clara said cheerfully from the table. I hoped, Margaret said, which was different. She looked at the doorway through which Evelyn had just passed. Something complicated moved through her face, guilt, maybe, or the closest thing to it. I just didn't let myself hope too much. Sunday came warm and clear. They drove out past the western edge of town, and along the ridge road that overlooked the valley, and for the first half-mile neither of them said very much, because neither of them needed to. That was, Evelyn had come to understand, one of the remarkable things about his company. The silences were comfortable. Not empty, not tense, just room. Then he said, my father used to drive this road. Did you grow up here? Partly. The estate is further west, but we'd come through Charlottesville twice a year for business. I used to look out the carriage window at the farms and calculate how much each one was producing, based on the field layouts. He paused. I was not a normal child. Neither was I, she said. I used to rearrange my father's filing system when I was 8. He was furious until he realized it was more efficient. He looked at her sideways. Was it, he asked. Demonstrably, she said. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a real laugh, not the controlled social approximation of one, but an actual, unguarded laugh, and it was so unexpected and so genuine that she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum and stay there. Miss Marlowe, he said when the laugh had settled. Yes? I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not to make me feel better. That's all I know how to do, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The road curved and the valley opened up below them. Do you think? Started again. Do you believe people can be genuinely known? Not liked. Not admired. Known and still chosen? She understood the question. She understood it in the marrow of her bones. The way you understand something that has lived in you so long, it stopped feeling like and started feeling like a wound. She said, I've spent 26 years being told that the parts of me most worth knowing are the parts least likely to get me chosen. Yes, he said quietly. So I think the answer breathed in. I think it's possible. I think it happens rarely and requires two people who have both learned to be honest at some personal cost. And I think when it happens, it is. She paused. I think it's the only kind of love that's actually worth having. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I had an engagement. 4 years ago. I know. I read about it. A beat. She was gracious and warm, and exactly what everyone said I needed. And we liked each other very much, but he stopped. She never once told me I was wrong, not once in 8 months. Even when I clearly was. He looked straight ahead. I realized I was lonelier engaged to her than I'd been alone. That's when I ended it. The papers said it was mutual. We agreed that saying so was kindest, and was it, she asked. Kind? No. But it was easier. She thought about this. About loneliness inside of closeness, which was the cruelest kind. I've been lonely all my life, she said, in rooms full of people who found me difficult to categorize. I know, he said. You couldn't possibly know, she said. You're Nathaniel Whitaker, and you think that's a protection against loneliness. Isn't it? No, he said. And the simplicity of it, the flatness, the complete absence of self-pity was more devastating than any elaboration could have been. No, it is not. The carriage moved along the ridge. Below them the valley was golden green in the late afternoon. Evelyn thought, he is telling me something real. He is handing it to me plainly, the way I've always wanted to be handed things. And I can either hold it carefully or I can do what I always do, which is calculate the risk until the moment passes. She thought, I have been calculating risks my whole life. And I am still sitting here alone, holding ledgers at parties. She looked at him. Nathaniel, she said. He turned. She'd never used his given name before. I'd like to stop being careful for approximately 5 minutes, she said. And I'd like you to know that what I feel when I am in your company is the closest I have come, in 26 years, to feeling like the right person in the right place. The carriage slowed, without either of them touching the reins, the horse following the curve of the road at its own pace. He looked at her with that open expression, the window thrown wide one, and said, 5 minutes. I can work with that. And he did too. And the road curved on below them, and the valley held the last of the light, and neither of them was careful for considerably longer than minutes. 3 weeks after the drive along the ridge road, the invitations started arriving. Not to the Marlowe household, to Evelyn specifically. Her name, written out in full on the front of envelopes that previously would have been addressed to her mother or her sisters. Dinner at the Hargrove estate. A Sunday afternoon gathering at the Pembroke house. A musicale at the Aldridge property that Evelyn had not been invited to the previous 2 years running. She set them in a stack on her desk and looked at them for a long time. Clara came in, saw the stack, and counted them with visible satisfaction. 6 invitations in 10 days, she said. A personal record. They're not for me, Evelyn said. Your name's on the front. They're for the woman Nathaniel Whitaker has been seen driving with. She pushed the stack slightly to the side. That's a different person. Clara sat down. Evelyn. You are that person. I know who I am. I'm saying they don't. She looked at her sister. 3 months ago, Mrs. Aldridge looked through me at the dry goods store. Last Tuesday, she stopped her carriage to ask after my health. The only thing that changed is that a powerful man started paying attention to me. Maybe they just finally noticed Clara. Her voice was gentle but firm. They noticed him. Not me. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, does that bother you more than you're letting on? Yes, Evelyn said, because lying to Clara had never been worth the effort. It bothers me considerably, because of what it means about them, or because of what it means about you and Nathaniel. The question landed with precision. Clara was 22 and frequently underestimated. Both, Evelyn said, possibly. She picked up her ledger and went back to work. But the stack of invitations stayed in her peripheral vision all afternoon, and the question Clara had asked stayed considerably longer. She went to the Hargrove dinner because her mother asked her to, and because refusing felt like flinching, and Evelyn had spent a long time refusing to flinch. It was a larger gathering than she'd expected. 20 people, maybe more, arranged around a table long enough that voices got lost between one end and the other. Nathaniel was there. He'd arrived separately, which was proper, but he found her within the first 10 minutes and stood beside her, during the pre-dinner gathering, with the easy certainty of a man who had decided where he intended to be and saw no reason to disguise it. She was aware of every eye in the room. "You're uncomfortable," he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. "I'm fine. You're doing the thing where you hold your hands completely still when they'd rather be doing something. You've done it 4 times since I walked over." She looked at him. "You've memorized my tells. I pay attention to things that matter to me," he said simply. "Are you actually fine or are you managing?" "Managing," she admitted. "The invitations this week. The way people are," she stopped. Glanced at the room. Everyone was engaged in their own conversations, but she felt the awareness of them anyway, the peripheral attention. "I spent a long time being invisible here. The visibility is an adjustment. Does it help that I find the visibility entirely warranted?" "It helps and it complicates simultaneously," she said. "Which is inconvenient. Tell me later," he said. "All of it. I want to hear all of it." "Later," she agreed. Dinner was served, and they were seated, not beside each other, which would have been improper at a hosted gathering, but across and 2 seats down, close enough for Evelyn to observe him in conversation with the men on either side of him. He was different in company than he was with her. Not false, she didn't think he was capable of false in any meaningful way, but more contained. More economical. He answered questions without volunteering more than was asked, listened with his full attention, and declined 2 separate attempts to draw him into conversations about his personal affairs, with the smooth deflection of a man who had learned early how to protect the parts of himself that were not public property. She recognized it, watching him across the table, because she did exactly the same thing. The woman beside him she was introduced as Mrs. Collingwood, recently arrived from Richmond. A widow of some social standing, was beautiful, in the way certain women were beautiful, which was to say completely and apparently effortlessly, with the kind of easy grace that Evelyn's mother had spent years trying to cultivate in her daughters, with mixed results. Mrs. Collingwood laughed at something Nathaniel said, and touched his arm lightly and looked at him through her lashes in a way that was practiced enough to be nearly invisible. Evelyn watched this and felt something cold and specific move through her chest. She picked up her fork and turned to the man on her left and asked him about his grain operation, because she needed something useful to do with her hands and her mind before the cold thing in her chest had time to become a full-formed thought. The man on her left, a Mr. Beaumont, agricultural landowner, clearly delighted that someone had asked him a question he could actually answer, talked about his grain operation for the better part of 40 minutes. Evelyn listened, asked follow-up questions, identified 2 inefficiencies in his storage methodology without meaning to, and suggested a structural modification to his drying process that he wrote down on his dinner napkin. By the time the dessert course arrived, Mr. Beaumont was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just found a $20 bill in a coat pocket. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "you know more about grain storage than my own foreman." "My father's been in agricultural land for 30 years, she said. "I've been reading his record since I was 12. "Well," he tucked the napkin into his jacket pocket, "I hope you'll allow me to follow up on that drying modification. That alone could save me," he calculated briefly, "a significant amount." "Of course," she said. She looked up from Mr. Beaumont and found Nathaniel watching her from across the table. He wasn't watching Mrs. Collingwood, who was at that moment saying something undoubtedly charming to the man on her other side. He was watching Evelyn, and his expression, unguarded for just a moment, in the way it was sometimes unguarded when he thought he wasn't observed, was something she didn't have a word for yet, but she felt in her sternum like a hand placed flat against her chest. She looked back at Mr. Beaumont, but she didn't feel cold anymore. After dinner, while the room reformed into smaller conversation clusters, Mrs. Collingwood materialized at Evelyn's side with the smooth inevitability of a woman who had somewhere decided this conversation needed to happen. "Miss Marlowe," she said pleasantly, "I've heard so much about you. I wouldn't have expected that, Evelyn said honestly. Oh, everyone's talking about you. She said it lightly, as though it were a compliment, but there was something underneath it, a calculation, small and careful. The Marlowe girl who's caught Nathaniel Whitaker's eye. Quite the achievement. I haven't caught anything, Evelyn said. We have a professional association. Mrs. Collingwood smiled. It was a beautiful smile. Everything about her was beautiful, effortlessly and completely. Of course, he consults you on his land holdings. He does. He consulted me on his Richmond investments once upon a time. A pause, silk smooth. We have our own history, Nathaniel and I, long before the current professional associations. Evelyn looked at her directly. Then perhaps you should tell him that, rather than me. Something shifted in the other woman's expression. Just slightly. I'm only suggesting that you understand what you're engaging with. Nathaniel Whitaker is not a simple man, I know, Evelyn said. That's why I find him interesting. Interesting, Mrs. Collingwood tilted her head slightly. Fascinating way to describe a man who's been one of the most sought-after bachelors in Virginia for 6 years. I don't think of people in those terms, Evelyn said. Sought after suggests a kind of currency I don't trade in. The beautiful smile again, sharper this time at the edges. How refreshingly unique. She moved away. Evelyn set her cup down carefully. Her hands were completely still. She was managing again, but this time she was managing something that burned rather than froze. A hot and private anger at the particular condescension of a woman who believed that beauty and social position constituted a complete set of credentials. She was still managing it when Nathaniel appeared at her shoulder. Mrs. Collingwood, he said without preamble. She has a history with you, Evelyn said. She wanted me to know. We were briefly acquainted in Richmond. 3 years ago. He was quiet for a moment. It was not significant. She seemed to feel it was. What she feels and what was true are separate things. He turned slightly toward her. Did she say something I should know about? Nothing I couldn't handle. Evelyn looked at him. Did you know she'd be here tonight? A pause. No. All right, she said, Evelyn. He said her name the way he'd said it since the drive without the formal prefix. The way you say a name when it has become a specific weight in your mouth. If anything she said, I handled it. She met his eyes. I'm not fragile, Nathaniel. I'd rather know the truth than be protected from it. That's always been true. He looked at her for a moment. Then, quietly, I know. Then trust it, she said. He nodded once. She picked up her cup and turned back to the room. But later, much later, in her own room, in the dark, she lay awake and thought about Mrs. Collingwood's face, the calculated smile, the implication beneath the pleasantry. You understand what you're engaging with, she thought. What am I engaging with, precisely? A man who was lonely and closed and had been sought by women far more socially equipped than her for 6 years. A man who had ended an engagement because his fiancée had never disagreed with him. A man who looked at her across dinner tables with that particular expression she still didn't have a word for. She thought, I know what I feel. I know it's real. The question is whether real is enough when the world is watching and has already decided what it expects from him. She did not reach a conclusion. She fell asleep with the question still open, which was unusual for her. She preferred closed questions, solved equations, confirmed results. Love, she was discovering, did not function like a survey. The Pembroke gathering was the following Sunday. It was smaller, 12 people, an afternoon tea, the kind of social event that looked informal, but was actually precisely structured in the way only women who had been organizing social events for 30 years could manage. Mrs. Pembroke was that kind of woman, warm on the surface, with iron architecture underneath. Nathaniel had not been invited. It was a family gathering, technically, which meant Evelyn was there not as someone adjacent to his orbit, but as herself, just Evelyn Marlowe, daughter of the small Charlottesville landholding, come for Sunday tea. She'd expected the old invisibility, the polite distance. the being spoken to rather than spoken with. What she found instead was worse. They wanted to talk about him. Every conversation she entered circled back to Nathaniel within 3 exchanges. What was he like in private? Was he as reserved as he seemed in public? Was it true the Whitaker estate had 300 rooms? Was he really going to expand the rail line through Charlottesville? Did Evelyn know his intentions? She answered what she could, which wasn't much, and deliberately wasn't, and deflected what she couldn't, and felt increasingly like a window they were trying to see through, rather than a person they were talking to. Mrs. Pembroke's niece, she was perhaps 20. Fresh-faced and confident in the way of a young woman who had not yet been significantly disappointed, cornered Evelyn near the tea service with the directness only the very young could deploy without social consequence. "Is it true he's going to propose?" she asked. Evelyn blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Nathaniel Whitaker. People are saying he's going to propose by the end of the season." She said it with the bright enthusiasm of someone sharing good gossip rather than impacting the person directly in front of her. Everyone thinks it's the most romantic thing. A man like him choosing someone, so she stopped. Seemed to realize something. "I mean, it's very romantic." "Someone so what?" Evelyn asked quietly. The girl flushed. "I only meant unexpected in the nicest possible way." "Unexpected," Evelyn repeated. "You know what I mean. You're not the sort of that is. No one expected he would. The point is it's romantic." Evelyn set her teacup down. "Excuse me," she said. She found the hallway, then the front porch. The afternoon air was cool, and she stood in it and breathed deliberately, the way she did when she was working through a problem that didn't want to be solved. "Someone so unexpected. You're not the sort." 26 years of different versions of this same sentence, and it still landed the same way. Like a hand pressed flat against a bruise you'd forgotten was there. She heard the front door open. "Miss Evelyn?" It was Clara. Her mother had insisted Clara accompany her to the gathering as a social buffer, and Clara had spent most of the afternoon eating small sandwiches with cheerful disengagement from the proceedings. "I saw you leave. What happened?" "Nothing," Evelyn said. Then a girl said something. "What did she say?" Evelyn told her. Clara's expression went through several phases. "Unexpected," Clara said finally. "In the nicest possible way," Evelyn added flatly. "I'll put something in her tea." "Clara, I'm not serious." A pause. "Mostly." She came to stand beside her sister. "You know what she actually meant." "I know exactly what she meant. She meant that she's 20 years old and hasn't figured out yet that what she was raised to want and what's actually worth wanting aren't always the same thing." Clara looked at her. "She's not important." "It's not her specifically," Evelyn said. She stopped. "The whole room in there. They're not interested in me, Clara. They're interested in what I represent to him. And I keep wondering, is that what I am? To everyone? Even to him?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you actually believe?" she asked. "No," Evelyn said. "But I can't stop the question." "Then ask him," Clara said simply. "You've told me you can be honest with each other. So be honest." Evelyn looked at her sister. "You make it sound easy," she said. "It's not," Clara said. "But you've never done things because they were easy. That's literally never once been your problem." She went back inside. Evelyn stood on the porch another minute. Then she went back inside too. And she lasted until the gathering ended and answered questions about Nathaniel with polite deflection, and listened to speculation that was really about power and money dressed up as romance, and kept her hands completely still. She wrote him a letter that evening. It took her 4 drafts. The first 3 were too careful, too constructed. The 4th she wrote without stopping and sent before she could reconsider. It said, "I've been asked 3 times this week whether you're going to propose. I've been called unexpected once. I've sat in 2 rooms where I was primarily interesting as a point of proximity to you rather than as a person. I'm telling you this not to alarm you, but because you ask me to tell you things, and this is a thing. I'm also telling you because I find I need to ask you directly, what am I to you? Not as a consultation. Not as a professional asset. As a person. I need an honest answer, and I need it now rather than later, because I have been careful all my life, and I would like to stop being careful before the thing I'm being careful about has already passed. She sealed it before she read it again and sent it out with the Morning Post. His answer came by return post the following afternoon. It was 3 sentences. Come to the estate on Saturday. Not for the documents, for the answer. NW. She read it twice. Then she went to find her mother and told her that Nathaniel Whitaker had invited her to the Whitaker estate on Saturday, and she was going. Her mother sat down in the nearest chair. He invited you to the estate, Margaret said. Yes, just you. With appropriate accompaniment, of course, Evelyn said. But yes. Her mother looked at her, really looked at her, in the way she rarely did, past the surface and the management and the careful cultivation of expectation. Her eyes were bright with something that took Evelyn a moment to recognize. Pride. All right, her mother said softly. All right, Evelyn. The Whitaker estate was 1,200 acres of working land in the Shenandoah Valley, and Evelyn, noted from the financial journals, but knowing a fact and encountering its reality were consistently different experiences. The carriage road ran for nearly a mile from the main gate to the house itself, lined on both sides with fence that was functional rather than decorative, well maintained, built to last. She noticed the land the way she always noticed land cataloging, assessing, noting the quality of the soil, the efficiency of the field layouts, the placement of the outbuildings relative to the work they were designed to support. It was good land, well-managed land. Someone had been paying attention to it for a long time. Her mother had accompanied her as propriety required and was sitting across from her in the carriage with the expression of a woman who had decided to be perfectly composed and was working quite hard at it. Nathaniel met them on the front steps. He shook her mother's hand, said something to make her laugh. He had a gift for this. Evelyn had noticed, making people laugh at the exact right moment, the kind of gift that looked effortless and was probably not, and then looked at Evelyn. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for the invitation, she said. Her mother was shown to a comfortable sitting room with tea and a quietly efficient housekeeper, and Evelyn and Nathaniel walked out to the property. Not to a formal parlor, not to a study with documents. Out, into the land itself. They walked for a while without speaking. She looked at the fields. He walked beside her. The quiet between them was comfortable in the way it always was, room, not void. Then he said, I had a meeting in Richmond last week. One of my board members, a man who has known me for 15 years, said something after the meeting. He said he'd heard I'd been spending considerable time in Charlottesville. A pause. He said, and I'm giving you the precise words. I hope she's suitable, Nathaniel. A man in your position can't afford to be sentimental. Evelyn kept walking. What did you say? I said that sentiment and judgment weren't mutually exclusive, and that I'd found the most reliable way to assess a person's value was to work with them closely on problems that mattered and see what they did. He glanced at her. He said that wasn't what he meant by suitable. What did he mean? He meant, does she come from the right family? Does she have the right presentation? Will she be an asset to the business or a liability to the image? He said it plainly, without inflection. He meant, is she the kind of woman who looks right beside a man like me? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. And what did you tell him? She asked. I told him he was asking the wrong questions. He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood facing each other in the open air of the working land. Evelyn. Yes. What am I to you? He said it back to her, quietly, not mocking, not careful. Just returning it. You asked me first, so I'm asking you. What am I to you? She hadn't expected this. She'd expected to be answered, not turned around and asked. She stood with it for a moment, feeling the question settle. You're the first person, she said slowly, who has ever made me feel like the most useful thing about me isn't the most important thing about me. She paused. You make me feel like the useful parts and the other parts are both worth having. At the same time. Together, she met his eyes. I've never felt that before. I don't know what to do with it most days, but I know I don't want it to stop. He was quiet. You said you needed an honest answer, he said. Before the thing you were being careful about had passed. Yes. Then here it is. He looked at her with the window thrown wide expression, fully open, nothing held back. I've been thinking about asking your father a particular question for 3 weeks. I've been holding off because I didn't know if you were ready to be asked. And because he stopped. Something crossed his face. The crack in the wall thing, small and real. Because I've been wrong before. About knowing when something was real. And I can't afford to be wrong about this. Her heart was doing something extraordinary, and she was not going to catalog it later. She was going to let it do the extraordinary thing. I'm ready, she said, to be asked. He looked at her. Are you certain, he said. Because once I ask your father, this becomes something the whole county knows about and weighs in on and has opinions about, and I can't protect you from that part of it. I don't need protecting from it, she said. I've been navigating other people's opinions my entire life. I'm very good at it, he said. That's not what worries me. Then what does? He was quiet for a moment. That you'll be so good at navigating everyone else that you forget to tell me when you're actually hurt by it. She stared at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say. Of all the conclusions he might have drawn, he had drawn the right one, the specific and accurate one, the one that required actually knowing her to locate. She stopped. That's a fair concern. I know it is, he said. I'm asking you to tell me, when it happens, not manage it alone first and tell me afterward. Actually tell me, she said. It won't be natural at first. I know. I'm asking you to try anyway. All right, she said. Yes. All right, he looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Saturday, he said. I'll call on your father Saturday. Saturday, she said. They stood in the field, and the land stretched around them on all sides. Working land, real land, the kind of land that required attention and care, and the willingness to show up every single day, regardless of conditions. She thought, this is what I know how to do. I know how to show up. I know how to pay attention. I know how to do the real work. She thought, so does he. Then, from across the field, a rider was coming toward them, one of the ranch hands. Moving quickly, with the posture of someone carrying news that wouldn't wait. Nathaniel saw him and went still. Mr. Whitaker. The rider pulled up, out of breath. Message from Richmond, sir. From the board, urgent. He took the folded paper. Read it. His face went through something that Evelyn, who had learned to read him carefully over months of close attention, recognized as contained alarm. He looked up. The Richmond deal, he said. There's been a challenge to the Eastern property title. The one you flagged in August. The 1,879 county line discrepancy, she said immediately. Yes. He handed her the paper. She read it. Her mind moved fast, the way it moved when a problem was real and immediate, and required actual thought. This is solvable, she said. You need the 1,879 county records and a title attorney who specializes in jurisdictional boundary disputes. I know someone in Richmond. He handled a similar case for my father's neighbor 6 years ago. You know someone, he said. I make it my business to know people who are good at specific things, she said. His name is Harrington. I can write to him today. He looked at her. Today, he said. The board will want a resolution in hand before they meet again, she said. Write to Harrington today, get his confirmation by Wednesday, present the solution at Thursday's board meeting. It contains the alarm before it becomes a crisis. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then you are remarkable. I'm practical, she said. The problem is solvable. So, we solve it. But something in his face had shifted again back to that open, unguarded expression, but more intense now, more definite, like something that had been leaning toward a decision and had just made it. Saturday, he said. I'm calling on your father Saturday, regardless of Richmond. I know, she said. You don't seem surprised. I'm not surprised, she said. She looked at him, felt the thing in her chest that she wasn't going to catalog, that she was just going to let be what it was. I'm glad. He looked at her one more moment, then he turned to the writer. Tell the housekeeper we'll need to send an urgent letter. Yes, sir. He looked back at Evelyn. Will you come and write the letter with you, she said. Yes, of course I will. They walked back toward the house together, fast and purposeful, her mind already working through the Harrington letter, the board timeline, the title documentation they'd need. And underneath all of it, running quiet and warm and constant like a river below the surface of working land, was the thought then, Saturday. He's coming Saturday. The problem was solvable. So was everything else. What she could not have known, walking back across that field, practical and sure and more hopeful than she'd been in 26 years, was that the crisis in Richmond was only the first of 3 things that were about to test every piece of that hope. The second would come from a woman she'd already met, and the third from a truth she hadn't yet been told. And one of them was going to break her open in a way that no ledger, no survey, no efficient solution could fix. The Harrington letter worked. By Wednesday, exactly as Evelyn had predicted, the attorney's confirmation arrived at the Whitaker estate. He had handled 3 similar jurisdictional boundary disputes in the past decade. He knew the 1,879 county records well. And he was confident the title challenge could be resolved within 30 days. Nathaniel presented the solution at Thursday's board meeting in Richmond, and the alarm that had been building among his investors collapsed before it fully formed. He wrote to Evelyn that same evening. The letter was longer than his usual ones. It covered the board meeting, the attorney's initial assessment, the next steps in the title process. And at the very end, in the same precise hand she'd memorized months ago, a single added line. You solved it before it became a crisis. I'm not sure I've ever had anyone do that for me before. She read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in the box with the others and went back to her father's quarterly accounts, which needed reconciling regardless of how warm that line made the space behind her sternum feel. Saturday came. Her father received Nathaniel in the front parlor alone, which was proper, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes. Which Evelyn knew because she counted every one of them from her position in the study directly across the hall, where she was absolutely not listening at the door and was instead very productively failing to read the same page of agricultural data 4 times in a row. Clara appeared beside her at the 30-minute mark. You're not reading that, Clara said. I'm reading it. You've been on the same page since he went in. It's a complex page. Evelyn. Clara took the document gently from her hands and set it aside. Breathe. I'm breathing. Breathe like a person, not like a machine managing its temperature. Evelyn breathed. It helped marginally. At 40 minutes, the parlor door opened. Her father appeared in the hallway. He looked at Evelyn with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something layered and complex and slightly undone, the expression of a man who had just been required to feel several things at once. Evelyn, he said, Mr. Whitaker would like to speak with you. She set down the pen she'd been holding. She hadn't been writing with it, just holding it, which was apparently what her hands did when they didn't have anything useful to do. She stood up, smoothed her dress, walked across the hall. Nathaniel was standing near the window when she came in. He turned when he heard her, and the expression on his face was so open, so completely undefended, that it stopped her 3 steps into the room. She had never seen anyone look at her that way, like she was both the answer to a question and the beginning of a better one. Your father said yes, Nathaniel said. I gathered, she said. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of her voice. He stopped, looked at her. I had a speech. I actually wrote one, which is not something I do. You wrote a speech. 4 sentences. I crossed out 3 of them because they sounded like a land contract." She laughed. The laugh surprised her. It came out before she could decide whether to let it, real and warm and nothing like the polite social sounds she'd spent years producing in place of actual laughter. "What was the 4th sentence?" He looked at her steadily. "Marry me." The room was very quiet. "That's not a question," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "It's a request. From a man who doesn't make them often and means this one completely." A pause. "I could make it a question if you prefer the grammatical precision." "I prefer the honesty," she said. "Then marry me. Not because it's convenient or strategic, or because you'd be a useful person to have beside me, though you would be. But because I am considerably less myself without you than I am with you. And I've only known that was possible since I met you." She felt something in her chest that was not going to be catalogued or assessed or held at arm's length until she'd analyzed it for structural integrity. She felt it and she let it be exactly what it was. "Yes," she said, "Nathaniel." He crossed the room. He took her hands in both of his. His hands were warm and certain, and held hers like something he intended to hold for a long time. He looked at her face with that specific expression that she finally, standing there in her father's parlor, found the right word for. Relief. The profound and private relief of a person who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just found somewhere safe to set it down. She thought she probably had the same expression on her face. She thought she didn't mind that one bit. Her mother, when told, sat in the kitchen chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Clara stood in the doorway watching her with visible anxiety. Then Margaret Marlowe looked up at her eldest daughter, really looked at her, the way she had done on the Saturday of Nathaniel's first visit, past the surface and the management, and said, "I owe you an apology." Evelyn went still. At the Hargrove estate, her mother said, "What I said about you making men feel stupid." She stopped. "I believed I was being practical. I believed I was preparing you for the world as it was so you wouldn't be hurt by it." A pause. "I was wrong. I was telling you to make yourself smaller because I was afraid the world wouldn't make room for all of you. And I should have," her voice caught, briefly. "I should have taught you to take up more space instead." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn sat down across from her mother. "I know why you did it," she said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but it makes it forgivable." She looked at her mother. "You're forgiven, Mama." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. She held it the same way she'd held it when Evelyn was small, tight, and certain. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "I know," Evelyn said. "He looks at you like you're the most interesting thing in the room." "He told me I was the first night." She paused. "I didn't know what to do with it then." "Now?" Evelyn looked at her mother. She felt the warmth in her chest and the open quality of the day, and the strange new weightlessness of being someone whose future had just changed shape in the best possible way. "Now," she said, "I'm learning to believe it." The engagement was announced the following week. The reaction was immediate and total, which Evelyn had anticipated and had spent the days prior quietly steeling herself for. Letters arrived. Calls were made. Every woman in the county who had ever thought anything about Evelyn Marlowe, which turned out to be most of them, though what they'd thought varied considerably, suddenly found reason to express it. The positive responses were warm and numerous, and many of them carried an undertone that Evelyn recognized as the particular warmth of people who had been wrong about you and were now, in the light of external validation, quietly revising their assessment. She accepted these graciously because graciousness was free and spite was exhausting, and she had better uses for her energy. The other responses were fewer but more pointed. Mrs. Aldridge, mother of the boy whose arithmetic Evelyn had corrected at age 18, wrote a note of congratulations that was impeccably worded and contained, in its 3rd paragraph, a delicate suggestion that Evelyn might benefit from the guidance of a more socially experienced as she navigated her new position. She was available, the note implied, to provide this guidance. Evelyn wrote back a thank you note that was equally impeccable and contained no acknowledgement of the third paragraph whatsoever. Mrs. Collingwood said nothing publicly. She also left Charlottesville within the week, which Clara noted with barely concealed satisfaction, and which Evelyn noted with the private and uncatalogued recognition that some competitions are decided before either party acknowledges they were in one. The board member from Richmond, the man who had asked if she was suitable, sent a formal congratulatory note that read, between its correct lines, as an apology written by someone who didn't know how to apologize. Nathaniel told Evelyn about it, and she said she found it adequate, which made him laugh, which was still one of her favorite sounds. What she hadn't anticipated was the visit from Nathaniel's aunt. He had mentioned twice that his Aunt Josephine existed. He had not mentioned her with particular emphasis, which Evelyn would later reflect on as the most
telling point,
that he'd been trying to avoid exactly the conversation that was about to happen. Josephine Whitaker arrived at the Marlowe house on a Tuesday morning without prior notice, which was the first indication that she was a woman who operated by her own set of rules and considered other people's schedules a suggestion rather than a constraint. She was 70 years old, sharp-eyed, upright in her carriage in a way that suggested her spine had never once 7 decades made a concession to gravity. She had gray hair pinned severely, a black dress of excellent quality, and the expression of a woman who had decided to have a specific conversation and was not going to be distracted from it. Evelyn's mother showed her in, recognized immediately that she was outranked in some fundamental way, produced tea with efficient speed, and made a diplomatic excuse to leave the room. Which meant Evelyn sat alone across from Josephine Whitaker, in her own parlor, feeling for the first time in several months the specific sensation of being assessed rather than seen. "Miss Marlowe," Josephine said in a voice like polished flint. "You know who I am." "Nathaniel's aunt," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am. I raised him from 14, Josephine said. When his father died, his mother was unequal to the task. So it was me." She set her teacup down with precision. "I know that boy better than he knows himself. I also know what he needs, which is not always what he thinks he wants." Evelyn kept her hands in her lap, kept her face neutral. "I see. Do you?" Josephine looked at her directly. She had gray eyes the same shade as Nathaniel's, Evelyn noticed. "He has chosen poorly before. Not often, but the consequences lasted." "The Baltimore engagement," Evelyn said. Josephine's expression shifted slightly. "He told you about it. He told me she never disagreed with him, and it made him lonelier than being alone." Evelyn paused. "He told me when I asked him directly whether he'd ever been engaged before." "I prefer to know things plainly." Josephine was quiet for a moment. Something in her assessment shifted, not warmly, exactly. More like the slight recalibration of a precise instrument encountering unexpected data. "He's chosen you," Josephine said, "against the advice of people who have known him longer than you have. Against the expectations of his social position. Pause. Because you argue with him. Because I engage with him honestly," Evelyn said. "The arguing is incidental. He needs that," Josephine said. "He has always needed that. The men around him are too afraid of losing his business to tell him the truth. The women he's met have been too focused on his position to look at the man." She looked at Evelyn with the gray eyes that were so precisely like his. "But need and right are not always the same thing. And I want to know before this goes further who you are when things are difficult. Not when he's attentive and the land consultation is going well and the county is watching admiringly. Who are you when it's hard?" "I don't met her gaze," she said honestly. "I know who I've been when things were difficult before. I know I don't run from problems. I know I sometimes manage things internally when I should speak them aloud, and I know that I'm working on that." She paused. "I can't promise you I'll be perfect at this, but I can promise I'll be real. I don't know how to be anything else." Josephine Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her teacup and took a deliberate sip. "Nathaniel's father," she said, "was a brilliant man. He built everything that Nathaniel now manages from 40 acres and a single rail contract. He was also cold in the way that brilliant men sometimes are convinced that the work was enough, that his family should be grateful for the provision without needing the man himself. She set the cup down. Nathaniel grew up watching his mother be managed rather than known. He learned to do the same with everyone around him. Until it became a habit and then a wall. She paused. You are the first person in 6 years who he has allowed past that wall. I want to know why. Because I wasn't trying to get past it, Evelyn said. I wasn't thinking about the wall at all. I was thinking about the survey discrepancy and the water table data, and whether his surveyor had used the correct county line. She looked at Josephine steadily. I wasn't trying to impress him. I was just being myself. And he responded to that, I think because it was the one thing he wasn't expecting. Josephine was quiet for a long moment. My nephew, she said finally, wrote me a letter 3 weeks ago. He told me he had met someone who made him feel like himself. Not the version of himself that runs an empire and manages a board and presents a face to the county. Himself. The sharp eyes held Evelyn's. That is the first time in 30 years he has used those words. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, Evelyn said quietly. Then understand this as well. Josephine's voice did not soften exactly, but it changed in quality, less flint, more something older and more carefully kept. I will not be a problem for you. If you are what he says you are, and I am beginning to believe you are, I will be your most useful ally. This family has a great deal of history, and not all of it is kind, and you will need someone who knows where all of it is buried. A pause. But if you hurt him not by accident, not by the ordinary injuries of two people learning each other, but by carelessness, by prioritizing your own comfort over his, then I will be something else entirely. I understand, Evelyn said. Good. Josephine set down her teacup and picked up her gloves. Now, tell me about the Harrington solution. Nathaniel's letter mentioned it, but was vague on the methodology, which tells me he didn't fully understand it himself. I'd like to understand it. Evelyn stared at her. Then, for the second time in recent memory, she laughed before she decided to open and genuine, surprised out of her. Josephine Whitaker watched this with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained the infrastructure of one. The methodology, Evelyn said, straightening, starts with the 1,879 county records. If you'll allow me, she reached for the nearest piece of paper. It's easier if I show you. By all means, Josephine said. They spent the next 90 minutes going through it in detail. When Josephine left, she shook Evelyn's hand rather than nodding, which Evelyn had the sense was a significant distinction. Her mother appeared from wherever she'd been waiting the moment the carriage pulled away. Well, Margaret said. I think she approved, Evelyn said. You think? She didn't tell me I was wrong about anything. For Josephine Whitaker, I believe that constitutes approval. She was right. A letter arrived the following morning addressed to Evelyn directly, which her mother said was unprecedented, consisting of 3 sentences. You'll do. Don't let him overwork himself on the Richmond business. He does this and then won't sleep. J.W. Evelyn showed it to Nathaniel that Thursday, and he read it and went very still for a moment. She wrote to you, he said. She directly. He looked at the letter. Then at Evelyn. She's never written directly to anyone. She's never done that. She told me not to let you overwork yourself. He stopped. The controlled face had that crack in it again, the specific small fracture she'd come to recognize as the place where things actually lived in him, under the management. She must have liked you considerably, he said, very quietly. I explained the Harrington methodology to her, Evelyn said. In detail, he stared at her. You spent an hour talking to my terrifying aunt about title dispute methodology. 90 minutes. She asked good questions. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did the thing he did rarely, the thing she'd only heard a handful of times. He laughed. A real one, from somewhere unmanaged and genuine. And she felt it in the same place she always felt it, behind her sternum, warm and staying. "You're remarkable," he said, when the laugh had settled. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it," he said. Every time more than the last. The weeks moved toward the wedding with the particular speed of time when something you've been waiting for is finally coming too fast and not fast enough simultaneously. There were practical matters to resolve, of which there were many, because marrying a man with a 1,200-acre estate and an expanding rail operation was, at its base, also a significant operational undertaking. Evelyn threw herself into the practical matters with her whole mind, because that was how she processed the emotional ones, not by avoiding feeling, but by giving the feeling somewhere useful to go. She reviewed the Whitaker estate accounts at Nathaniel's explicit invitation and identified 4 areas of improvement within the first 2 weeks. She met with the estate manager, a competent man named Grover who had been doing things a particular way for 20 years and who required approximately 3 conversations to accept that Evelyn's suggested modifications were not criticisms of his work but refinements of it. By the end of the 3rd conversation, Grover was bringing her problems unprompted, which Nathaniel observed with an expression of pure satisfaction. "He's worked for me for 8 years," Nathaniel said. "He's never brought me problems unprompted. He presents solutions." "Solutions without the problems attached are just claims," Evelyn said. "I told him I wanted to see the problem first. He appreciated the directness." "Most people don't. Grover does." She looked up from the estate ledger. "He's been managing alone for a long time. He doesn't need someone to fix things. He needs someone to think alongside him." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly what you did for me," he said. "I know," she said simply. He was watching her, with that expression again, the specific one, the relief one, the one that meant something she still felt newly every time she saw it. She looked back at the ledger. The North storage accounts are understated. "Has Grover been underreporting to keep the figures clean for the board?" "Probably," Nathaniel said. "He thinks they'll pull the expansion budget if the storage costs look too high." "They'll pull it anyway if the understatement is discovered," she said. "We need accurate figures and a justification document." "I can write the justification. I'll have Grover pull the real numbers," he said. "Today," she said. "Before Thursday's review." Today, he agreed. This was how they were, the ease of it, the efficient shorthand, the sense of 2 minds working the same problem from complementary angles. She had never had this before. She hadn't known it was possible to have it. She found it every day, quietly extraordinary. What happened on the Wednesday before the Thursday estate review was not quiet and not ordinary, and not anything she had been prepared for, despite all her preparation. It began with a letter, not from Nathaniel, not from Josephine, not from anyone in the county whose name she recognized. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, the return address a Richmond law office she'd never heard of. She opened it in the study. She read it once, quickly. Then she sat very still. Then she read it again, slowly, making sure she had understood it correctly. She had. The letter was from an attorney representing the estate of one Gerald Whitaker, Nathaniel's father. It stated that in reviewing the elder Whitaker's private papers, following a recent inventory of estate documents, they had discovered a codicil to the original Whitaker trust, a private agreement, signed 12 years prior, between Gerald Whitaker and a business partner named Archibald Holt. The agreement, the letter stated, gave Holt's family a 30% interest in the Whitaker Northern Rail expansion in exchange for capital during the company's early growth period. The agreement had never been disclosed, not to Nathaniel, not to the board, not to any legal review in the 12 years since Gerald Whitaker's death. Holt's son, now an adult, now aware of the agreement's existence, was prepared to exercise that 30% limit against the northern expansion. The expansion Nathaniel had spent 2 years planning. The one Evelyn had spent 4 months helping him structure. The letter asked whether Miss Evelyn Marlowe, understood to be advising on the Whitaker estate financial matters, was in receipt of any relevant documentation. She set the letter down, She thought, very carefully and very fast, the way she thought when a problem was real. She thought, he doesn't know. He cannot know. If he knew about a 30% undisclosed interest, he would not have structured the expansion the way he did. He is meticulous, and he is honest, and he does not hide things, which means his father hid this from him, which means he is about to learn something about the man who built everything he has built upon that will shake the foundation. She thought, this is not a land survey error. This is not a boundary discrepancy. This is not something a Harrington letter fixes in 30 days. She thought, I said I would tell him things. I said I would not manage alone and tell him afterward. She picked up the letter. She stood up. She found her coat. And she drove herself to the Whitaker estate, not waiting for Thursday, not waiting for proper notice, not managing the problem first until she had a solution to present because she had made a promise. And the promise mattered more than her comfort, and he needed to know this now, today. From her, before the attorney sent the same letter to him, and he read it alone. He was in the North Field with Grover when she arrived. The housekeeper sent for him. He came in from the field with the direct, unhurried walk she'd come to know, and found her in the front hallway, still in her coat, holding the letter. He looked at her face. What happened, he said. She held out the letter. He took it. Read it. She watched his face move through the same progression hers had: quick read, stillness, slow read, deeper stillness. The stillness at the end was different from the first. Harder. Something had gone out of his expression, or gone in, she couldn't tell which. He looked up. My father, he said. Yes. He made this agreement 12 years ago. Yes. And didn't tell me. A fact being placed. No, she said quietly. He folded the letter, set it on the hall table. He stood with his back slightly toward her, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the specific quality of stillness that meant he was doing the thing she'd once done: managing. Processing alone, building the wall up before he'd decided to. Nathaniel, she said. He turned. I drove here the moment I read it, she said. I didn't work on it first. I didn't come with a solution. I just came, because I told you I would tell you things. Not manage them alone first. She looked at him steadily. You needed to know this from me, not from the attorney's next letter. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in the hard, controlled stillness of his face, the wall coming up, the careful management broke. Not collapsed, not crumbled, but broke the way good, strong things break when they've been holding something they shouldn't have had to hold alone. He crossed the distance between them. He put his arms around her, and she felt the weight of him, not fragile, not fallen, but real, fully real, letting himself be held the way she'd always wanted to be held, and she held him back with everything she had. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, against her hair, I don't know what kind of man he was. I thought I did. You knew the parts he showed you, she said. Parents give their children the version they can manage. That doesn't mean you were wrong to love him. I built everything on what he built. What he built was real, she said. The foundation is real. What was hidden doesn't erase what's real. She felt him breathe. And the Holt claim it's a legal problem. Legal problems have legal solutions. We'll find one. Harrington or someone better. But that's for tomorrow. And today, he said. Today you found out something hard, she said, and you're not alone with it. That's all today needs to be. He held her a moment longer. Then he straightened, stepped back. She could see the effort of it, not pulling away from her, but putting himself back together in the specific way of a man who had learned early that composure was survival, and was now slowly learning that he didn't always have to be composed. You drove yourself, he said. The carriage was faster. You didn't wait to have a solution. I told you I wouldn't. She met his eyes. I meant it. He looked at her, that expression, the real one, the relief one, and underneath it something she recognized because she had it too, the fragile, durable, absolutely terrifying thing, that is trust when it's finally placed somewhere that holds it. "I know you did," he said. "I know." The Holt claim moved fast once it became public knowledge, which happened faster than either of them had hoped. By Monday morning, 3 days after Evelyn had driven herself to the Whitaker estate with the attorney's letter, the news had reached the Richmond papers. Not the full story, just enough. A disputed interest in the Whitaker Northern expansion. An undisclosed agreement from the elder Whitakers era. A potential 30% claim that could restructure the entire operation. Nathaniel's board called an emergency meeting for Wednesday. He told Evelyn about it Tuesday evening, sitting across from her in the Marlowe study with the estate ledgers between them and the particular quality of stillness he had when something was bad and he was being honest about how bad it was. "They're going to push for a settlement," he said. "Pay Holt's son a lump sum, close the claim, move forward. They want it quiet. And you," she said. "I want to know whether the agreement was legitimate." His jaw was tight. "My father signed it. It has his signature, witnessed correctly, filed in a private deposit box I didn't know existed. Which means either he forgot to tell me," he stopped, "or he chose not to. Which do you think it is?" He looked at the table. "I think he chose not to. I think the Holt investment came in at a moment when the company needed capital, and my father made a promise he later decided was inconvenient to keep. And when he died, the inconvenience died with him." He looked up. "Except it didn't." "No," Evelyn said quietly, "it didn't." "The board doesn't care about that part," he said. "They care about the expansion timeline. They care about investor confidence. They want the problem solved cleanly, regardless of whether the solution is right." "And what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want to honor the agreement," he said. "If my father made a legitimate promise, then the Holt family is owed what they were promised. I don't get to benefit from his word and ignore its cost." She looked at him across the table. She felt the thing in her chest that had been building since the beginning, since the painting of the bridge, since the first letter. Since the ridge road and the field and the hallway where he'd let himself be held, and it was no longer a crack or an opening or a careful hope. It was solid. It was certain. It was the most reliable thing she knew. "Then tell the board that," she said. "They'll fight it." "I know." She held his gaze. "Tell them anyway. You're not your father. You don't have to inherit his evasions along with his land." He looked at her for a long moment. "Come with me," he said. "To the board meeting." She blinked. "Unconventional." "Yes." He didn't waver. "You understand the financial structure better than half the men in that room. And I want—" He stopped. "I want them to understand what they're dealing with. Not just me, both of us. They'll say you're letting your fiancé run your business." "Let them say it." His voice was flat and certain. "I'm interested in what's true, not what's comfortable." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "I'll need the full board financial documentation before Wednesday. I'll have it sent tonight, and the original Holt agreement. I want to read the language myself, already requested from the attorney." She picked up her pen. "Then I'll be ready." He watched her turn to the ledger with the focused, immediate competence that he had never once in all these months taken for granted. And he thought not for the first time that the world had been remarkably careless to let her spend 26 years in a corner with a ledger before anyone had the sense to look properly. The Holt documents arrived by messenger at 10 that evening. Evelyn read them at the kitchen table while her mother sat across from her drinking tea and pretending to read a novel. By midnight she had found something. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought it through twice, making sure she hadn't misread, making sure the logic held. It held. She wrote Nathaniel a letter immediately, sealed it, and handed it to the Marlowe housekeeper to be sent first thing in the morning with instructions that it was urgent. She went to bed and did not sleep. The letter reached him at 6 in the morning. She knew because he appeared at the Marlowe front door at 7:30, before any hour that could be reasonably considered appropriate for a social call, which told her everything she needed to know about how he'd reacted to what she'd written. Her father answered the door, looked at Nathaniel's face, and stepped aside without a word. Evelyn was already in the study. "Tell me," he said, the moment he came through the door. "The Holt Agreement specifies a 30% interest in the northern expansion," she said. "But it defines the northern expansion by the 1874 boundary survey. The project scope you've been working from uses the 1882 resurvey." She put the document on the table and pointed. "The acreage in the current expansion plan is 40% larger than the acreage described in the original agreement. Holt's claim as written applies to a project that no longer exists in its original form." Nathaniel looked at the document. He read the relevant section. He read it again. "The claim is for a different project," he said slowly. "The claim is valid for the project your father agreed to in 1878, she said. "That project was restructured twice, once in 1881 and once in 1883, and the current expansion shares the same geographic corridor, but is legally a distinct undertaking under a different scope document." She looked at him. "Holt's son has a legitimate claim against something that technically no longer exists in the form that was agreed to. He may have a right to renegotiation. He does not have an automatic right to 30% of what you're building now." The room was very quiet. "Harrington," Nathaniel said. "Harrington needs to see this today," she said, "before the board meeting. Because if the board settles tomorrow without understanding this distinction, they'll pay 30% of the current expansion value for a claim that may only be worth 30% of a 1878 project valuation. The difference is, she had calculated it already. Substantial. She told him the figure. He sat down. She gave him a moment. She understood what it felt like to have a number land on you. "You found this," he said in one evening. "The language was specific," she said. "And I read things carefully." He looked at her across the table. "Evelyn, it needs to go to Harrington today," she said. "A moment." His voice was very quiet. "In a moment." He looked at her with the full open expression. Nothing held behind it. No management. No wall. "Do you understand what you've just done?" "Found a boundary discrepancy in a private agreement," she said. "You saved the expansion," he said. "You saved 2 years of work and—" He named the figure she'd calculated. "And you did it at midnight with a document you'd had for 2 hours." "The document was clear once I knew what to look for," she said. "The 1874 boundary language was the key. Anyone would have." "No," he said firmly and quietly. "Not anyone. Not anyone at all." He leaned forward. "I need you to hear that. Not anyone, you." She looked at him. Felt the warmth of it, not the frantic warmth of relief, but something deeper, something that had been building, since the first letter and the first survey and the first laugh, accumulating quietly like interest over time. "All right," she said. "Me you," he said now. He stood up. "Let's go to Harrington." The board meeting on Wednesday lasted 4 hours. Evelyn sat at the conference table in the Richmond office, the only woman in the room. A fact that was noted by every man present in various ways ranging from open curiosity to poorly concealed skepticism, and she did not apologize for being there, and she did not make herself smaller to manage their comfort, and she did not wait to be addressed before she addressed them. When the board chairman, a man named Forsyth who had been running Whitaker board meetings since before Nathaniel inherited, began the session by suggesting move to the settlement discussion before reviewing the full documentation, Evelyn said, "I'd like to propose we review the boundary language in the original agreement before any settlement figures are discussed." Forsyth looked at her, then at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said, "Miss Marlowe is correct. The boundary language is the critical point." Forsyth's expression indicated that he had many opinions about this development and was currently restraining all of them for professional reasons. Harrington walked them through the legal analysis. Evelyn answered 3 questions that were directed, with pointed indirection, at Harrington, but were actually about her work. She answered them directly and completely, and did not soften any of the figures. By the 3rd hour, 2 of the board members had stopped looking skeptical and started taking notes. By the 4th hour, Forsyth himself had asked her a direct question about the 1,883 scope restructuring and whether the absence of Holt's signature on the restructuring documents constituted implicit renegotiation, and she had answered it with the precision it deserved. When the meeting ended, the board voted unanimously to renegotiate rather than settle, with Harrington conducting the renegotiation using Evelyn's boundary analysis as the foundational document. The potential payout was reduced by 60% before Holt's son's attorney had even seen the revised terms. In the hallway afterward, Forsyth stopped beside Evelyn and said, with the stiff precision of a man who did not apologize easily but understood when it was necessary, "Miss Marlowe, your analysis was thorough. Thank you," she said. "I'll admit I had reservations about your presence today." "I know," she said. "They were unfounded." "I know that, too," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one, and walked away. Nathaniel appeared beside her. "Thorough," he said. "High praise from Forsyth," she said. "I'll take it." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she knew, the real one, but there was something additional in it now. Something that had been tested and held and confirmed. "Marry me," he said sooner. She looked at him. "We're already engaged." "I know. I'm saying sooner. I don't want to wait until spring." He held her gaze. "I want to stop doing this separately. The work, the problems, all of it. I want us on the same side of the table." She thought about this for exactly the amount of time it took to confirm that she had no argument against it. "October," she said. "October," he agreed. The wedding was set for the 14th of October. The news reached the county within 48 hours and produced a second wave of social response that was, if anything, more intense than the engagement announcement. Because October was soon and soon implied a certainty that some people had apparently still been holding reservations about. Mrs. Aldridge sent flowers. Mrs. Collingwood, still absent from the county, sent nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Josephine Whitaker sent a letter that said October is acceptable. "Don't let him wear the gray coat. It makes him look like a banker." JWN showed it to Nathaniel. He looked pained. "She's been saying that about the gray coat for 3 years. Is she wrong?" A pause. "Then don't wear it." "I like that coat, Nathaniel." He wore a different coat. The weeks before the wedding moved the way important weeks did, simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, every day carrying too much weight to pass quickly, yet somehow passing anyway. There were practical matters that Evelyn handled with her characteristic efficiency, and there were emotional matters she handled with less efficiency and considerably more honesty than she would have managed 6 months ago. When her mother came into the study one evening and found her sitting at the desk not working, just sitting, staring at the surface of the desk with the particular stillness of someone who had too many feelings and not enough categories for them, she didn't pretend otherwise. Her mother's. Terrified, Evelyn said. In the best possible way, which doesn't make it less terrifying. Her mother sat down across from her. "Tell me, I've been myself my whole life," Evelyn said, "and it's kept me safe. Useful. Alone." She looked at her mother. "And now I'm about to go share my life with someone, fully share it. Not just the professional parts, but all of it. Every morning, every problem, every time I'm wrong. Every time I'm hurt and my first instinct is to close the door and solve it alone." She stopped. "I don't know how to do that yet. Share all of it." "No one does," her mother said at first. "How do you learn?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Then, you start with one true thing. Every day. Just one thing you say out loud that you'd normally keep quiet. And you watch what he does with it. And he watches what you do with his." She paused. And eventually you stop keeping track of who's sharing more, because it doesn't feel like a transaction anymore. It feels like she searched for the word. Breathing. You stop noticing you're doing it because it's just what keeping yourself alive requires. Evelyn looked at her mother. You and Papa, she said. 31 years, her mother said. We were terrible at it for the first 5. A small, private smile. We got better. I want to get better faster, Evelyn said. I know you do. Her mother reached across and covered her hand. That's already a head start. The morning of the 14th of October, Clara came into Evelyn's room before dawn and sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. She just sat there, warm and present, the younger sister who had never once resented the older one for being different and difficult and too much. Who had said, don't talk yourself out of it before it begins on a night months ago that felt like a different life. Evelyn looked at her in the dark and said, thank you. For what? Clara said. For always seeing me correctly. Clara's eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling with the determination of a woman who had decided she was not going to cry before 7 in the morning. You're my sister, Clara said finally. Seeing you correctly is the easiest thing I've ever done. The ceremony was at the Marlowe property church, small and honest, the way Evelyn had insisted and Nathaniel had agreed to immediately, with the clean relief of a man who had no interest in spectacle and considerable interest in the thing itself. Josephine Whitaker sat in the front pew across the aisle and watched the proceedings with the expression of a woman who had decided to approve and was going to do so with precision and dignity. When Evelyn walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her father who hadn't said much about any of this, but whose hand on hers was trembling very slightly, which said everything she looked straight ahead. Nathaniel was standing at the front, waiting, in the dark coat that was not the gray one. He was watching her walk toward him with an expression she had seen before, the full open window thrown wide expression, but this time there was nothing cautious in it. No management, no wall, just him, completely and without apology, watching her come toward him as though she were the answer to every question he'd ever thought to ask. She reached him. He took her hand. She felt it, the warmth, the certainty, the solid real weight of two people who had looked at each other honestly and chosen what they found. You came, he said quietly enough that only she could hear. I told you I would, she said. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm glad anyway. The vows were exchanged. The words were the traditional ones, old and well-worn and still entirely true. When it was over, and the small gathered crowd was rising, Josephine Whitaker was seen by several witnesses who would later report it with some astonishment to press her handkerchief briefly to the corner of her eye. She denied this subsequently with complete authority. No one entirely believed her. They spent the first weeks of their marriage at the Whitaker estate, which was now Evelyn's home, and the adjustment was not seamless because real things rarely were. She learned the rhythms of a household that had been organized around one person's habits for years and brought her own habits into it, and there was friction, small and manageable, the ordinary kind. She reorganized the estate filing system on her third day. Grover found her in the records room at 7 in the morning, surrounded by 6 years of documents, and said, with the equanimity of a man who had already learned which battles to consider, I'll have breakfast sent in, shall I, Mrs. Whitaker, please, she said, not looking up. And the 1,881 land expansion records. Do you know where those are? Third shelf, left side, brown binding, Grover said. I'll get them. She looked up. Thank you, Grover. He nodded. Welcome home, ma'am. She went back to the documents. Felt the weight of those 2 words settle around her, quiet and solid and entirely true. Home. Nathaniel found her an hour later, still in the records room, breakfast half eaten beside her, surrounded by reorganized files, and a list of questions she'd generated about the 1,881 expansion decision. He looked at the room, looked at her. You're reorganizing my records, he said. Your previous system was chronological without cross-reference, she said. I'm adding a property code index. Once it's done, you'll be able to find anything in under 2 minutes rather than she checked her watch. The current average of 11. He leaned against the doorframe. 11 minutes? I timed Grover yesterday, a pause. You timed Grover to establish a baseline. She looked up. Is this a problem? He looked at her, the expression, the real one, the one that lived in the place below the management, and she could see him deciding not to laugh. Holding it with the controlled precision of a man who had strong feelings about maintaining dignity, and losing that particular battle entirely. He laughed. She listened to it fill the room and felt it land in her chest the way it always did, warm and certain, and entirely worth all 26 years of waiting for something real. It is not a problem, he said when he could speak. It is, in fact, the most Evelyn thing you have ever done. I'll take that as a compliment. It is one, he said. Absolutely and completely. The Holt renegotiation concluded in November, 6 weeks after the wedding. Harrington's team, working from Evelyn's boundary analysis, reached a settlement that honored the spirit of Gerald Whitaker's original commitment while correctly valuing it against the 1,874 project scope, rather than the current expansion. Holt's son received a fair sum, less than his attorney had initially claimed, more than nothing, commensurate with what had actually been promised. Nathaniel signed the settlement documents at the estate desk, with Evelyn beside him, and then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. My father, he said. Yes, she said, I keep thinking. He stopped. I keep trying to decide what kind of man he was, whether the agreement he hid was a mistake or a choice. Does it change anything? She asked. About what you're building. He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about real things. No, he said. What I'm building is mine and yours. He looked at her. It doesn't need to carry his errors. No, she agreed. Just his good work. It was real, he said. That much I'm sure of. She put her hand over his on the desk. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the quiet of the estate they were building together, which was neither perfect nor finished, but was entirely, durably real. The expansion broke ground in the spring. At the ceremony, a small one, practical, marked with a handshake and a shovel rather than a speech. Forsyth shook Evelyn's hand alongside Nathaniel's, which no one in attendance failed to notice. She managed the northern land accounts herself. Not because Nathaniel couldn't find someone else to do it, he could have, and had been offered several names by the board, but because she was better at it than anyone he'd been offered, and because the work mattered to her, and because they had agreed, somewhere in the weeks of correspondence and meetings and honest conversations that had built them, that usefulness and love were not competing values. They could occupy the same life. They were, in fact, strongest together. Grover brought her problems twice a week and stayed for the solutions. The filing system became the estate standard. 2 other Virginia landowners, having heard about the reorganization from their business contacts, wrote to ask if Mrs. Whitaker might be available to consult on their own record systems. She wrote back to both of them. She set her own terms. They accepted. Nathaniel found her letter of acceptance to the first consultation on the desk, and srit and said very quietly, "You know this is going to become something." "I know," she said. "Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready for that since I was 11, she said, reorganizing my father's files. She looked at him. The world just needed to catch up. He looked at her with the expression she had loved, since the first time she'd seen it open, real, relieved, certain, and said, "It has." 6 months after the wedding, Margaret Marlowe came to the Whitaker estate for Sunday dinner, which had become a regular occurrence, and found her daughter sitting at the large estate desk, going over rail accounts with 2 of Nathaniel's managers. All 3 of them arguing cheerfully about a discrepancy in the northern freight figures, while Nathaniel sat across the room reading correspondence and interjecting periodic observations without looking up. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched her daughter hold her position in the argument firm, clear, and correct, as the subsequent 15 minutes confirmed, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for 26 years. Later, in the kitchen, while Grover organized tea, she said to Josephine Whitaker, who had also come for Sunday dinner and had decided to remain through the week because the records room needed her assessment, which was Josephine's way of saying she preferred it here. She's happy. Of course she is, Josephine said. She has work that uses her whole mind, and a man who's smart enough to be glad of it. She poured tea with the precision she brought to every action. The world catches up eventually, to the right people. I wasted years, Margaret said quietly, telling her to be less. Yes, Josephine said without cushioning it. You did. Margaret flinched slightly. But you stopped, Josephine said. And she forgave you, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person you raised, even when you were raising her wrong. She handed Margaret a cup. Don't waste the rest of the time. Margaret took the cup, looked at her daughter through the open study door, still arguing cheerfully about freight figures, completely at home in her own intelligence, fully inhabiting the life she'd been told she was too difficult to deserve. She did not waste the rest of the time. On a Thursday evening in November one year, almost to the day, after a girl had stood near a potted fern at the Hargrove estate and calculated the cost of candlelight and believed, deeply and with all the long evidence of her life, that she was not the kind of woman anyone would choose, Evelyn Whitaker sat in the estate study with her husband's hand on her shoulder and her own hands moving over the accounts she'd built from nothing. And she felt the particular quality of rightness that comes not from being fixed but from being found. Not found by him. That was the part the world kept misunderstanding, kept retelling as the story of a man who saw what others missed. Nathaniel had not fixed her or saved her or transformed her from a lesser thing to a greater one. He had simply been present when she stopped apologizing for what she already was. And she had been present for him, the man behind the empire, the man who was lonely before he was powerful, the man who had needed one person to argue with him, honestly more than he'd ever needed anything money could build. They had found each other. Two people who had spent their lives being told that the most real parts of them were liabilities, learning together that they were, in fact, the whole point. The freight account balanced. It always did when she did it. Outside, the Shenandoah Valley held the last of the autumn light. Inside, Nathaniel bent down and said quietly into her hair, "Come to dinner." "In a moment," she said. "They'll wait," he said. "Dinner won't." She looked up at him. The expression on his face was the one she knew would always know, had memorized so thoroughly it had become part of how she understood the world. Open, real certain. She closed the ledger. She stood up. She took his hand. The world had told her, for 26 years, that she was too much and not enough, that her mind was a problem and her heart was a complication, that a woman who made men think instead of feel was a woman who would end up alone with her ledgers. And it had been so certain and so consistent, and so many voices saying the same thing that she had very nearly believed it. She had not changed a single thing about herself to prove them wrong. She had simply refused, finally and completely, to believe them. And that one quiet, hard-won refusal had made all the difference.